Hello guys and welcome back. So in this video we're going to speak about constraint layouts in Jetpack Compose. So constraint layouts can help in placing children relative to each other and is an alternative to using multiple rows, columns, box and custom layouts. So this is useful when we are going to implement in a slightly large and complex layouts with more complex alignment requirements. So without relying on nesting a lot of rows, columns and box, we can just easily use constraint layout, which is just going to be a flat view hierarchy. So in the view system, constraint layout was the recommended way to create large and complex layouts, as a flat view hierarchy was better for performance than nesting them. So, however, this is not the case in Compose, which is able to handle efficiently deep layout hierarchies. So we can just nest whenever we want, and we can just have the same performance when we are using constraint layouts. So in this video, we're just going to speak about the basics of constraint layouts. Okay, so without further ado, let's go together and build something else. Okay, so by default here, the constraint is not added, so we can just come here inside our build.gradle. And we're just going to press this implementation here. So you can find this inside the documentation. So constraint layout compose 1.00. And this is just the current version as we're just recording this video. So we can just sync here and we can get started. Okay, so we can just delete this because we're not going to need them anymore. And also we can just remove this. Now let's create here a little room and then we can just start here. Now for our case here, let's create a new composable and we can just call this my screen here. So as how we use, for example, to create a box or a column, we can create a constraint layout by calling this constraint function here. And we have this constraint layout here. And inside here now we can just pass in several parameters. So for our case here, we're just going to leave it. And for now here, we can just first pass in a modifier. Yes, we have to pass in here a modifier. And we want to fill the max size because by default this constraint layout is going to wrap its content, so it's going to measure its children, then it's going to take up the size. So we want to take up the whole size of the screen, and for that case we are just passing here fill max size. Now let's create here also a little room, and for now here the first thing which we want is each composable is required to have a reference. So back then when we are using view system, we were using IDs of the views in order to get the reference of a certain UI element. So for now here we have to create a reference, and for this case here you can just create a variable, and there are different ways of creating these references. So for example, you can just create the reference, or you can just create a single reference for a certain item. So for case here, we're just going to create multiple items. So we're just going to call, for example, the first name reference. And also we have the second name. And also we're just going to have a button here. So we are going to have two text fields that are going to be displayed side by side. And also we have a button which is going to be in the center. So for that case, we have this, and we can just call here create refs. And basically here now we are just going to create these references and we can just attach to our views. Now for case here now, let's create our first item. And for the first item, we're just going to create here a text field. And we are not going to implement anything here. So for case here, we can just pass in nothing. And here we're just going to pass in an empty lambda function. Okay, so here we want to assign the reference to this text field so that the constraint layout knows that this is just going to be a certain type of item which we can try to add the constraints. So for case here, we have to use a modifier to do this case. So I have here a live template, which is just mcons here. It's going to add a modifier, and we have a constraint as, and inside here constraint as, we have to pass in a string or anything else which is going to represent that this is going to be a certain item. So for case here, we have this first item, and we're just going to call this first name here, for example, to be our first item of this item here. And let's just add here, and we can call a label. And here we can just basically pass in a text, and here, for example, we can just call this first name. Okay, so as you can see here, we have added and tell that the constraint layout, hey, this is just going to be the first name here, and you have to get the reference this to be the first name. Whenever we call first name, the constraint layout knows that we are referring to this text field here. Now we want to specify the constraints, and here inside this, the constraint scope here, we can just easily define these constraints. And for the case here, for example, we have a top And here you have to provide the link to. So we are just specifying here top and we want to link it to. And for the case here in constraint layout, we have a parent item which is going to represent the screen of a constraint where we are the constraint layout by whole. So here we're just going to call parent the top, and we can just try to pass in here a margin. So we can just call here margin, and we want to pass in a margin of 16 dp. And for that case, we have our item ready to use. Now let's create here a preview function that is going to help us to preview this. And we can just call this prev. So we want to preview my screen and we want to show the system UI. So we can just call here show system UI and we can just set this to true. And here basically now we can just call my screen. Okay, now let's review here what we have already written. Okay, so here is our preview. We can just try to come inside here. And as you can see here, we have our constraint which we have specified here to come to the parents. And we have specified a margin of 16 dp, which is going to push up this to this place here. Now let's come here also and add another padding. So for example, here we want to add a start. And we can just call this a start.link to. And here basically now we want to add a padding of, and here we can just call this a start, and we can add here a margin also of 16 dp. Now let's try to rebuild again and see. Okay, so as you can see here also we have added here another constraint which has come from the start here and also has a 16 margin dp. Now for that case, let's come here and finish up. So what we want also here, we want to display another text field here to contain the second name. Now for this case here, now let's add another text field inside our code. So we can just easily copy this. And we can just press Ctrl D in order to duplicate this. And here we can just easily change to second name. And for that case here, we want also to pass in here second name. And we're just going to leave this top to start from the top margin. And we want this start to start from the, we want to link now the composable. So we have displayed here the first name. So we want our composable to start from when this is going to end here, then it's going to start the other composable. And for this case here, now we can just call here our first name. And here we can add .end because this is just going to be the end of this. Now let's try also to preview again and see. Okay, so as you can see here, we have a slight problem here. As you can see, this second name composable is going to start from this position here and then going outside of the screen, and it's not visible. So we want all of these two composables to be visible inside the screen. So we can just fix this inside our code here. Now also we want to define this text field where it's going to be ending. So we can just specify the end value. And here we can just provide the link to, and we want this to end when this composable is going to start here, and we have our second name. So we can just call second name dot start. So this is going to end there. And also we want to pass in here a margin of 16 dp. Okay, also here we want to define the end, and we can just call here end dot link to. And here basically we want this to end to the parent.end. And we can pass in here a margin of 16 dp also. Okay, so what we want to do here, we want to constraint or to tell this to only occupy the constraint which is going to have. So here we can just call this, we can provide the width, and we can just make this call. We can call here the dimension.field constraints. So this one is just going to tell, hey, text field, just occupy this space here where you have been constrained to. And we can just easily copy this and tell the second text field also to take this space. Now let's come here to a split view and we can just see our code. Okay, so as you can see here, we have fixed that problem where this composable was pushed outside of the screen here. And as you can see here, now they are taking the same space inside our screen here. And this is just the beauty of code of constraint layouts here. So if the screen is going to be bigger, then these constraints are also going to be bigger. And for that case here, also we want to add another button, the submit button, which is going to be situated between this and inside the center here. Now let's do this right now here. Okay, now let's create here a new button. We can just call here button composable. And also here now we can just pass in here our modifier. And here now we want to call this button. And for that case here now we can start to provide here our constraints. Now we want to link this from the first name, so we can just call here top. And we can just call here our first name, the top, and also we can just provide here a margin of 16 dp. Okay, so also we want to center this. So as you have seen here, we have our composables. So we want to center this here. And in order to do this, we can just easily create here a center. So you can just call this center horizontally here. And this one is going to center this. So we can just call here parent. So we just pass in here a parent, and this is going to basically center this. And for that case here, now we can just provide here our text, and we can just call this submit. Okay, let's preview again and see the output. Okay, so we have a slight problem here. As you can see here, we have linked this from to the top and to the top of this first name. That's why you are just seeing them inside here. Now we can just pass in here this to be bottom. And let's build and refresh again. Okay, now this has been perfectly spaced, and let's just zoom inside here and we can see it correctly. And as you can see here now, the submit button has been constrained from the bottom of this first name here, and we have provided a padding of 16 dp, and we have provided that center horizontally, so it has added here a constraint here and constraint here to the parent, and that's why it has been situated here center horizontally. So if also we could want to center this at the vertically, so we could just center here, we could call here center horizontally, and then it could add the constraint here and here, so that we can just easily center this pattern horizontally. Okay, so this was just the first way of working with constraint layouts. So for example, if you want to specify here the margin differently, so for example in portrait and landscape mode you want to specify here a different margin, how could you do this if you have this nested inside here the constraint layout? So for this case we have to be coupled then, and if we want for example to animate and do other things, so we have to host this to other places. So in order to do this, we can just create a private function here, and we can just collapse this for a moment and create a little room here. Okay, now let's create here a private function, so we can just call this private fun, and we are just going to call this decoupled. And this one is just going to take up a margin. And this must return a constraint set. Okay, so we want to return here a constraint set. So a set here is just going to contain all of the constraints which we have been using here, or we have been defining, for example, inside those composables using the constraint as and pass in the link to. So for case here now we can just call it return here. And we want to return here a constraint set. And basically now inside here we can create references. So for example here we want to create a reference which is, we are going to reuse it inside here my screen. So we can just create here an object that is going to hold up the references of our objects. So we can just call this object here, and we can just call ref. So this one is just going to help us to get the references. So for example here we have the first name. And here we have the second name. And here we have our button. Okay, so we have this reference class here, so we can just come inside here and create the references. So the first thing here, we have to create a button reference. So for example, you can just call this button. And we can call this create ref 4. So here we are just going to create a reference for a certain ID. So we can just call here our reference, which we have created here. And for example, here we have to pass in a button. So here we have our first name. And here we can call first name. And here we have a second name. And here now we have our references which we have created. Okay, so in order to pass in the constraint here, now we can just call here the constraints. You can just call this constraint here. Now we have to pass in here a reference. So for case C, we can just pass in here first name. And as usual, inside here now we have the constraint scope here, where we can just pass in our constraint. So for case we can just come here inside our screen here, and we have specified all of these. So we can just easily press Ctrl C and copy them, and we can just paste inside here. And also we can just create another constraint here. And this one we can just call it second name. And as usual again, we can just come inside here our second name and we can copy this. And we can just paste them inside there. And also we have to provide the constraint for the button. Okay, so we can just copy this and we paste them inside there. So I think here we have finished to create our constraint scope. So we can just use this constraint set here in order to pass it inside these items here. Okay, so we want to pass in here a different margin if we are in a portrait or landscape mode. So to do this, we can just create, for example, a box here, which is going to give us the max width and max height so that we can just calculate and see if we are in a portrait or landscape mode. So let's create here a box with constraints. And this is just going to give us access to the max width and max height. So we can just create here a variable and we're just going to call this constraints. And here we can just use an if statement. So we want to check if this max width, if the max width is going to be less than the max height. So if we're in this state, then we know we are going to be in a portrait mode. So we can just call this the coupled constraint state here, and we can pass in a margin of 16 dp. So here we are just portrait. And else here now we can just call our decoupled. And here we can pass in 36 dp, for example. So when we are just going to be in a landscape mode, so we want to pass in here 36 dp. Okay, so we can just refactor this by bringing them inside here. Okay, so we are just going to remove this. And we can just change this. So we want to remove this, and here, for example, we can just provide the layout ID. And for case here now, we can just use this decoupled state. We can just pass in here layout ID. So that's why we have created here our reference. So we have created here, for example, we want to pass in to be the first name. And the same applies to here. So we can just pass in here modify to layout ID. And here we can just use our reference. And we can call this second name here. And also we can do the same here. So we can just call this modifier with layout ID. And here we want to pass in here a reference. And here we want to call this to be a button. And as you can see here now, our composables are just free and they are clean. So we have to keep our decoupled constraint outside here. And for that case, we have our constraints. Okay, so we have been able to pass inside here the layout ID. So we will have to tell the constraint layout that is going to match this. So what we can do here, we can pass in the constraints. So we can just call this constraint set here and pass in our constraints, which we have created there. So we have a different constraint regarding the portrait or landscape. So here we have a decoupled constraint and with heading of 16 dp of margin of 16 dp and here a margin of 36 dp. And for that case, I think we have finished. So we can just come here inside our decoupled constraint. I think we have hard coded this. So we can just easily change here, for example. So you can just press here Control Shift plus Alt here in order to create here multiple cursors, which is going to help us to refactor all of this instead of just refactoring it again and again. And here now we can just press here Shift and we highlight all of this. And here basically now we can just call the margin. And we press Escape here to have our single cursor again. And I think here we have used that margin again. Now let's come here inside our split view and we can try to repreview again and see. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the same thing as the first time, which we did. And for now, we have used those clickable constraints. Now we want to see the different constraints. As you can see here, we are just using 16 dp. Okay, so before we call here before we start here inside our application, we can just call this my screen inside here. So we can just come here and call my screen, so that it can be instantiated inside this set content here. Now let's try to rerun again and see the output. Okay guys, so as you can see here, we have launched successfully inside here our phone. So when we try to rotate our phone here, we can just see the difference again. And as you can see here right now, we have a padding of 36. And here also we have a padding of 36, not as we are going to have a padding of 16 dp. So guys, this is how you can use constraint layouts. So I haven't covered other aspects such as mirrors and guidelines. So in the next video, we're going to create a complete screen using constraint layouts only. So for now, let's leave it here. See you in the next video.